Today I'm going to tell you a story so quiet, it almost whispers yet so powerful. It changes the course of a life set against the vast American West, where endless plains stretch beneath a sky that feels too big for mercy. It's a place where survival is never guaranteed, and where a single delay can turn a journey into destiny. It begins with a broken wagon axle, a small accident, ordinary and forgettable, yet enough to strand one woman at the exact point where two worlds were never meant to meet. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The Montana Territory rolled out beneath an endless sky, a hard country where distance alone could break a person. It was the kind of land that swallowed dreams, whole men chased fortunes into it, and left nothing behind but bones for coyotes and wolves. The year was 1868. Buffalo still thundered across the plains in numbers that turned the earth dark beneath their hooves. Though rumors already drifted on the wind riflemen with long barrels, steel rails pushing west, and a future calculated to erase what had come before, into that vastness stepped Lila Hart, 22 years old, fresh from Massachusetts, carrying a carpetbag heavy with books and a letter from the Interior Office promising work as a teacher at a reservation school that existed more on paper than on any map. She had gone west to outrun a quieter extinction, the slow narrowing of a woman's life, measured by Ring's children and polite disappointment. Lila wanted to count for something. She wanted to matter. Had she known what waited for her beyond the horizon, she might have stayed in Boston and accepted the life laid out for her. The stagecoach from Fort Benton never reached its end. An axle snapped 2 days short, leaving her stranded at a way station made up of a single rough-cut building and a corral full of tired horses that mirrored her own exhaustion. The station master, Silas Crow, a weathered man, steeped in whiskey, and old regrets told her repairs would take a week, maybe two. She could sleep inside the storehouse, he said, if she didn't mind sacks of flour and the occasional rat. She minded. It changed nothing. So Lila built herself a small refuge among the supplies and read by candlelight, while the wind clawed at the walls and wolves lifted their voices to the stars. On the third morning of her isolation, he came with the dawn, riding out of the pale light on a paint horse, moving with a smooth, unhurried grace that seemed almost unreal. He was one of the backbone people, though she would not learn that right away, nor that she was crossing their land to teach lessons no one had asked for. His name was Kestrel, but that knowledge would come later, after words shared, after lines crossed that could never be redrawn. He looked to be near 25 tall, lean, his features sharp as the mountain ridges to the west. There was a stark beauty to him, nothing like the soft gentleness praised in Boston parlors. He rode up dismounted and spoke with Silas Crow in a blend of English and another tongue Lila could not follow. Then his gaze lifted and found hers through the open doorway. Something sparked, quiet but unmistakable, leaping the space between them and settling deep in her chest. He had come to trade, Silas later explained, furs and hides for ammunition, tobacco, and glass beads. He comes through now, and then Silas said, one of the few who still deals straight with white folks. He called Kestrel a good man, the way one might praise a dependable mule. Lila bristled at the tone, even as she memorized every detail of the stranger who had looked at her, as though he saw past skin and bone. Kestrel returned the next morning, and the next. Always at dawn, always alone, always with some thin excuse that fooled neither of them. He brought hides no one needed, asked about trails he already knew, lingered at the corral brushing his horse far longer than necessary. And always, his eyes found Lila, watching her read, watching her step outside for air free of flour dust and rodents, watching her with an intensity that should have unsettled her, yet made her feel visible in a way she never had before. On the 5th day, she went to him. She couldn't have said why, only that the silence between them had grown too charged to bear, that it had to become something else, words perhaps, or truth. He saw her approach and turned without pretense. His expression calm, but his dark eyes alive with interest. She stopped a few paces away, close enough to see the beadwork on his shirt, to smell leather and smoke on his skin, and asked, her voice barely unsteady, why he kept coming back. His English surprised her. Roughened by accent, yes, but fluent, shaped by traders' missionaries and the slow friction of two worlds touching. He told her he returned because he had never seen a white woman with hair like fire, and he wondered how the sun had been caught in something so small. He said he came back because she read books, because in his experience, white people used books to wedge doors or win arguments, not to listen. And then he told her the last reason. When he looked at her, he felt something stir that had been still since Moonleaf died, along with their child Dawn 2 winters past. He had believed that part of himself gone forever, until Lila stepped down from a broken stagecoach and stared at the world as if it ought to make sense. She had no answer. No man had ever spoken to her like that, so plain, so unguarded. No one had ever told her she carried sunlight in her hair or woke something long asleep. Her mother, Abigail Hart, the Boston women, and every mirror she had known had taught her she was merely acceptable. Pleasant, not remarkable. Yet here stood a man from a world she barely understood, looking at her as though she mattered, of a face meant to inspire poetry, not wars or legends, and yet this man, this stranger, born of a world she barely understood, looked at her as though she were endlessly compelling. For a moment she didn't know whether to laugh, to cry, or to retreat back into the sod building and disappear among the flour sacks, until the stagecoach was fixed and she could return to a sensible future of teaching sensible lessons to children who barely listened. She did none of it. Instead, she asked him to teach her a word from his language. The smile that crossed Kestrel's face changed him entirely, easing the sharpness of his features into something open, almost youthful. He taught her the word for horse, then sky, then the color of her hair, which wasn't a single word at all, but a small phrase meaning fire caught in strands. She tried to repeat them, stumbled badly, and he laughed. The sound startled her, warm and unguarded, and soon she was laughing too. Whatever tension had stretched between them loosened, settling into something gentler, something that felt like the beginning of trust. The days that followed were unlike any Lila Hart had ever lived. She left her books behind and stopped returning to her narrow bed among the supplies. Instead, she spent her hours with Kestrel, trading words and stories across the wide space between their lives. He taught her how to read tracks pressed into grass, how to coax flame from nothing, how to watch the sky for signs of change. She told him about Boston, its stone streets, the sea voyage that had rocked her for weeks, the books she loved, and the ideas they carried about justice, equality, and the right to choose one's own path. He listened with an intensity that made her feel as though every word mattered. Sometimes he nodded. Sometimes he disagreed. Sometimes he told her ideas were beautiful, but unfinished, that they imagined a world where everyone began on equal ground, a world his people had never known. Her feelings for him did not arrive all at once. They crept in slowly, like water rising around her ankles, until suddenly she was submerged and could no longer feel solid ground beneath her feet. She fell for his mind first, for the way he questioned, the way he reasoned. Then she noticed his kindness, the care he showed his horse, the patience he offered the stray dogs near the station, the quiet gentleness he always reserved for her. It clashed with the scars on his hands and the hard lines of his life. And finally, without ceremony or warning, she became aware of his physical presence, the way he moved, the warmth of his voice, the steady heat of him when they sat close, exchanging language, as the sun crossed the sky. She had never been with a man. The truth of it was so long accepted, she had stopped questioning it, filed it away beside her plain looks and red hair. The reasons Abigail Hart and the Boston women had quietly marked her unsuitable. She had called herself a spinster, a word dry as dust and scented with old lavender. She had made peace with it, convinced herself she preferred books to husbands, solitude to compromise. But sitting beside Kestrel in the tall grass behind the station, watching evenings spill color over the mountains, that careful acceptance began to fracture. Something inside her stirred something she had spent years denying. He noticed. He always noticed. He turned to her, a question in his eyes. She met his gaze and spoke the bravest truth she had ever allowed herself. "I'm afraid," she said softly, "of what I'm feeling, of where it might lead. I've never—" She couldn't finish. The words caught heavy with inexperience and fear. But he understood. He had learned the language of her face as carefully as she learned his words. He read her uncertainty as clearly as she once read her abandoned pages. He didn't touch her, though his hands were tense with restraint. "My people have a word for this," he said. "It means standing at the edge of water you can't see across. It isn't wrong. It isn't. It comes before all great crossings." He paused, voice gentler still. "I won't ask you to step into the crossing unless you choose it. I won't take what you don't offer." For the first time since she had known him, doubt touched his expression. "But if you want, I can show you there is nothing to fear. I'll move slowly. I'll stop the moment you ask. And if you choose not to cross at all, I'll sit beside you on this bank, and that will be enough." She gave him no answer that night. Back among the flour sacks, she lay awake for hours, aware of her body, in a way she never had been. The unfamiliar warmth low in her belly refusing to be reasoned away. She thought of virtue and purity, of lessons built on the assumption that marriage would come, that there would be a man worth waiting for. And she thought of the life ahead if she boarded the repaired stagecoach, years of teaching quiet aging, and a death untouched by desire. She imagined never knowing what it meant to be wanted, not as a role, not as duty, but simply as herself, a body that deserved to be wanted. And she kept thinking about Kestrel, his patience, his restraint, and the promise he had given her that he would stop the instant she asked. A promise so careful it almost felt unreal. The stagecoach was finally repaired on the 8th day. Lila Hart did not climb aboard. She told Silas Crow she had changed her mind about the teaching post, said she would stay on a while, pay what she could work off the rest. Silas studied her with a look that said he understood more than he let on. He shrugged. "Your life," he said, "your mess." She thanked him and went to find Kestrel. He was where she expected, at the corral, brushing his horse in long, unhurried strokes, as steady as breath. She walked up and stopped closer than ever before, near enough to feel the heat of him through her dress. "I've decided," she said, her voice only barely shaking. "I want to cross the crossing. I want you to show me." He set the brush aside and faced her. His eyes searched hers, not for eagerness, but for doubt. Finding none, he lifted a hand and touched her cheek so gently it stole her breath. "Come with me," he said. "I know a place." It was a small clearing among cottonwoods, half a mile from the station, a quiet hollow where grass grew thick and the leaves sifted sunlight into gold and green. A creek ran nearby, its low song threading through the air. A buffalo robe lay spread on the ground, dark and rich. She understood then that he had prepared this place, hoping, never assuming. At the edge of the clearing, fear rose in her chest. Voices of Abigail Hart, of the Boston women, warning her of shame and ruin. But Kestrel stepped close, took her hands, and spoke before those voices could take hold. "I'm going to learn you," he said. "Like learning land, I'll find what brings you ease and avoid what brings fear. You'll tell me yes, no, stop, more. You'll speak, I'll listen. This is how we make the crossing safe." His voice was calm, sure. His hands were warm. She nodded, feeling fear loosen its grip. He began with her hands, lifting them, kissing her palms, her wrists, the tender skin along her arms. He moved slowly, pausing, often watching her face. She trembled, but not from fear alone. Warmth spread through her, fluid and unfamiliar. When he kissed the bend of her elbow, she gasped, startled by the intensity. He smiled softly. "There," he murmured, "I'll remember that." He traced her shoulders, her throat, the curve beneath her ear that made her knees weaken. He caught her when she swayed, laughing quietly as he steadied her. He had not crossed any line, not touched her beneath the dress, and already her body felt aflame. She had never known pleasure lived in such ordinary places. It felt as though he carried a map she had never been given, and with each careful discovery, her world widened. When his fingers reached the buttons at her collar, he stopped and looked to her for permission. She nodded. One by one, he undid them, revealing the white cotton beneath. Though the air was warm, she shivered as he slipped the dress from her shoulders and let it fall. He stepped back and looked at her, and the way he looked erased any shame she might have felt. "You're shaking," he said, concern threading his voice. "Do you want me to stop?" She shook her head. "It isn't fear," she said, surprised by her own certainty. I don't know what it is." "That's desire," he told her gently. "Listen to it." He guided her down to the robe, the fur soft beneath her back. Lying beside her, he continued, hands and lips, learning the shape of her, the rise of her chest, the line of her waist, the pull of her hips. Her breath grew uneven, her body answering each touch with sparks she didn't yet understand, but wanted all the same. He removed her shift with the same care, folded it as though it mattered. And when she lay before him, bare and open, she waited for shame to crash down on her, for Abigail Hart's voice, for the warnings of the Boston women, for the old lessons telling her she was ruined beyond repair. None of it came. There was only Kestrel watching her with the same steady, dark gaze that had found her from the first morning, looking at her, not as something taken, but as something long awaited. "Now I'll learn the rest of you," he said, his voice roughened by a desire she recognized as equal to her own. "Tell me if anything frightens you. Tell me if you want me to stop." She never asked him to stop. She answered him with yes, again and again, as his hands and mouth traced the lines of her body, discovering the places that stole her breath, the places that pulled sound from her throat, the place between her thighs that shattered her composure with pleasure, so sharp it nearly hurt. He moved with care and intent, charting her, as if she were land no one had ever walked before. And with every discovery, her fear retreated, replaced by a hunger she had never been taught she was allowed to feel. She had been told women endured desire rather than felt it. She knew now that was another lie. One more lie left behind beneath the cottonwoods. When he finally settled over her, she was already aching for what came next. He paused, searching her face. "It may hurt the first time," he said quietly. "If it's too much, tell me. I'll stop." "I know," she said, surprised by her own calm. "I'm not afraid of pain. I'm afraid of..." The words failed her. "Of being changed. Of crossing the crossing and not knowing who I'll be." He stayed still, his warmth surrounding her. "You will be changed," he said. "Every crossing changes us. But you'll still be you, the woman who reads, who questions, whose hair carries fire. You'll be that and more." He kissed her, then slow and tender. "Trust me. Trust yourself. The river only looks wide from the bank." She drew him down to her. When he entered her, there was pain, but it was brief, a sharp protest that softened as he waited, moved carefully, watched her breath. The strange fullness eased into something warm and grounding. Step by step, moment by moment, her body learned him, and pleasure replaced uncertainty. She understood then why people risked judgment for this closeness, for the feeling of being known, explored, and cherished all at once. When release finally overtook her, it rose slowly, coiling tight before breaking free. She felt weightless and anchored, at the same time, her body arching unfamiliar sounds, leaving her without thought or shame. He followed soon after, shuddering with her, and they clung together as the world gradually widened again. Trees creaked light, filtering through leaves. They lay quietly on the buffalo robe, limbs tangled, breathing, easing silence, settling like a blessing. She had crossed the crossing. She knew it in the looseness of her body, the calm in her mind, the knowledge now written into her flesh. Kestrel had been right, she was changed. And yet, she was still herself, Lila Hart of Massachusetts, lover of books, believer in justice and choice. She was all of that, expanded, deepened, made richer. Kestrel traced idle patterns across her skin lines that felt like a language she was just beginning to understand. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He smiled, that familiar softening of sharp lines. "I was wrong," he said. "I thought I came back for your hair and your books. But the truth is, the first time I saw you beside that broken stagecoach, you looked at me without fear. You saw a man, not what the paper men call us. Do you know how rare that is? She didn't. Not fully. But she was beginning to see beyond the divide her world had drawn, and it was darker, more complex than she had ever imagined. They chose each other anyway. She never went to the school promised by the Interior Office. She wrote a letter saying she had found a different kind of teaching, one without desks or chalkboards. No reply ever came, and she didn't miss it. Instead, she went with Kestrel to the Backbone people, who lived beneath the mountains whites called the Rockies. She was not welcomed at first. She was white, and white history carried pain. But she learned their words, their ways, and worked beside them, not above them. Suspicion softened into tolerance, then into something like trust, and finally into affection. The years that followed tested her in ways she could never have imagined. Beyond the lands of the Backbone people, the world was shifting fast. Buffalo herds, thinning treaties, tightening like ropes around every native nation. Kestrel's band was driven again and again, from one place to the next, each new ground smaller than the last, every move carving a deeper scar into the shared memory of his people. Lila Hart saw it all. She recorded it in journals, writing with a quiet hope that one day someone might read and understand what had been lost. She was no longer the young woman who had stepped off a stagecoach, believing she could change the world by teaching letters to children. She understood now that the forces pressing down on the Backbone people were relentless, too vast to be stopped by good intentions alone. And yet she stayed. She stayed because she loved him. Because his people had become her people. Because there was nowhere else she belonged. They had 3 children, 2 daughters, Aylin and Nara, and a son, Tomas, each born in a different place, as the band was pushed ever onward. Lila taught them English letters, as she had taught other children. But she also learned from the elders how to raise them within the ways of their father's people, passing down stories, songs, and skills older than any border. Her children would have to walk between two worlds, she knew. They would need strength enough to carry both. She wanted them to know all of who they were, even the parts the papermen would teach them to deny. And through it all, Kestrel never stopped learning her. Across the years, through births and funerals, through hunger and movement, he would sometimes take her hand and lead her away from the camp to a quiet place where the world could not intrude. There he would undress her slowly and learn her again. Time changed. Her body softened it, shaped it in ways she had once been taught to fear. He saw none of that as loss, only new ground to explore, new curves to map. He told her she was beautiful, that she carried the sun in her hair, that she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. She believed him because his touch spoke more truth than words ever could. She was beside him when he died, just as she had been beside him through nearly 30 years of hardship and joy. Fever, one more sickness carried by the white world, took him. There was nothing she could do but hold his hand and watch him slip away. His final words came in the language of the backbone people, a phrase she had learned long ago, "You who crossed the river for me." She answered him in the same tongue, telling him she would cross any river for him, had crossed rivers she never knew existed until he showed them to her. Then he was gone. She was alone, a white woman among the backbone people. A widow for the first and only time, carrying the memory of a man who had mapped her so completely. She would feel his hands for the rest of her life. She lived another 20 years, long enough to see her children, grown her grandchildren, and the riverborn running under open sky, long enough to witness the final breaking of the way of life she had chosen and loved. She never returned east, never went back to Boston, never sought out the family who had likely mourned her and moved on. She stayed with the backbone people, now confined to a reservation that was only a shadow of their old lands. She did what she could, easing change where she could, preserving what remained. She wrote down the stories shared by the story keepers, captured songs passed from mouth to mouth for generations, leaving a record of a world vanishing, even as she set it to paper. It was never enough, but it was something. On the night she died, she dreamed of cottonwood trees and a buffalo robe of a creek murmuring without end. She dreamed of Kestrel young again, lying beside her, his dark eyes filled with the same tenderness she had always known. In the dream, his hands moved over her once more, tracing her as he always had. "Don't be afraid," he said softly. "This is only another crossing. I'll help you." She was not afraid. She had not known fear since the day she first trusted him. She reached for his hand. He took it. Together they stepped into the water, crossing the final river, and the last thing she felt before feeling itself fell away was his hand in hers, steady and sure, guiding her home. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blaze the trail. Subscribe, share. Leave your thoughts in the comments and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso Legal/Disclaimer. These stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice imagery, and drafting as part of our creative process. But every final detail is carefully reviewed and shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deepfakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this content without written permission. Thank you for valuing creativity, respect, and original work.